Apple is looking for relief from the chip crunch behind this week's Mac and iPad price hikes. I'm told by a person briefed on the discussions that this includes asking the U.S. administration for more flexibility to work with Chinese memory suppliers. That request follows CEO Tim Cook telling the Wall Street Journal just last week that all vendor options are back on the table. At the center of this story are two names, YMTC and CXMT, China's heavily state-backed domestic memory producers. YMTC makes NAND flash, the storage memory in your phone. CXMT makes DRAM, the working memory that keeps every modern computer, server, and data center running. And in the middle of all this, China's largest memory chip maker has reportedly secured a deal worth nearly $3 billion from Tencent, one of the largest technology companies in the country. That news broke just days after reports surfaced that Apple itself was asking Washington for political clearance to buy memory from that very same Chinese supplier, ChangXin Memory Technologies, better known as CXMT. If this reporting holds up, it may be the strongest commercial endorsement in CXMT's short history. So today we're going to unpack what's actually happening, why it matters, and what it tells us about where the global chip industry is heading. Let's start with what's actually being reported. The Tencent CXMT agreement reportedly covers more than 20 billion yuan, roughly $2.94 billion in DRAM chips destined for Tencent servers, spread out over several years. That memory isn't for a pilot program or a small side project. It's meant to support cloud computing infrastructure, database systems, and artificial intelligence workloads, the exact categories of demand that are currently straining the global memory supply chain. What makes this significant isn't just the size of the number, it's what the number represents. CXMT is no longer being treated purely as a protected domestic challenger, propped up by state subsidies and patriotic procurement. It is becoming a supplier that major Chinese technology companies are willing to depend on at enormous scale for years at a time, for infrastructure that has to work. And that raises an obvious question. If Tencent is prepared to commit billions of dollars to CXMT, could Apple be next? This is a story about how a global memory shortage, an unprecedented AI infrastructure boom, and mounting political pressure are colliding, and in the process, rewriting the rules of the semiconductor supply chain. To understand why this deal is such a big deal, you have to understand the market it's happening in. For decades, the DRAM market has been dominated by three companies: Samsung Electronics, SK Hynix, and Micron. Together, they control the overwhelming majority of global production. That concentration has given them enormous influence over pricing, technology roadmaps, and, critically, who gets supply and when. When demand rises faster than new factories can be built, there are very few alternative suppliers capable of stepping in to fill the gap. And right now, demand is rising extremely fast. AI data centers are consuming huge amounts of advanced memory. Large language models need memory sitting physically close to the processor, so that data can move fast enough to keep enormously expensive computing hardware fully utilized. If the memory can't keep up, you end up with idle GPUs, which, at today's prices, is one of the most expensive forms of waste in the entire tech industry. At the same time, cloud companies still need conventional server DRAM for the unglamorous but essential work of running databases, virtualization layers, storage systems, and general-purpose computing. This demand doesn't go away just because AI is the story of the moment. If anything, AI adoption is pulling more traditional cloud infrastructure online as well. High bandwidth memory, or HBM, gets most of the headlines because it sits directly beside advanced AI accelerators, the chips doing the actual model training and inference. But when the largest technology companies in the world are all building infrastructure at the same time, demand doesn't stay contained to one category. It spreads across the entire memory market. HBM, standard server, DRAM, mobile memory, everything. The numbers reflect just how tight things have gotten. According to the latest reporting, DRAM contract prices rose roughly 95% quarter over quarter in the first quarter of 2026. That is not a gradual increase. That is a market in genuine crisis, and it's the direct backdrop against which this Tencent CXMT deal and Apple's reported interest in CXMT needs to be understood. So who exactly are YMTC and CXMT, and why are they suddenly relevant to a conversation that used to revolve entirely around Korea and the United States? Both companies make memory used in iPhones, PCs, and servers. Both are young compared with Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron, which built their businesses over multiple decades of accumulated engineering knowledge. But both are gaining market share quickly. According to Counterpoint Research, YMTC now holds roughly 13% of the global NAND market, while CXMT holds around 8% of global DRAM. Those aren't leadership numbers, but in a supply-constrained market, they don't need to be. CXMT is also preparing for what could become mainland China's largest IPO in years, a signal that its ambitions extend well beyond simply serving domestic customers. And according to Counterpoint, stakeholders across the supply chain are increasingly hearing the same message. Large cloud companies do not want to enter every quarter uncertain about price, availability, or delivery. In some cases, they are willing to provide prepayments or commit years in advance, simply to secure guaranteed supply. The reported CXMT Tencent agreement may run for 3 years. Another source has suggested it could extend as long as 5. Either way, this tells you something important. Tencent is not making a one-off opportunistic purchase to cover a temporary shortfall. This is a structural commitment. It's worth pausing here to explain why building a credible DRAM business is so difficult, because it explains both why CXMT took years to become relevant and why its current momentum is genuinely notable. DRAM is one of the most demanding semiconductor businesses to enter. On the surface, the product looks almost simple compared with something like a central processor or a graphics chip. There's no complex instruction set, no massive transistor logic array performing billions of different operations. But manufacturing DRAM profitably requires an entirely different kind of precision. A memory producer has to create billions of microscopic cells that store data reliably, at a scale that's difficult to comprehend. Every one of those cells has to work at high speed, consume very little power, survive repeated use over years of operation, and critically behave consistently across enormous production volumes. A single wafer might contain memory chips destined for hundreds of different devices. If even a small percentage of those cells behave inconsistently, the economics of the entire operation collapse. That level of precision is expensive to achieve, and it's the primary reason DRAM has remained a 3-company oligopoly for so long. Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron have spent literally decades refining their manufacturing processes. New entrants don't just need capital, they need years of accumulated process knowledge that can't simply be purchased. CXMT's early products were aimed mainly at China's domestic market, and for a long time many international customers had little reason to take the company seriously. Its yields weren't proven at scale, its reliability data was thin, its brand carried none of the decades of institutional trust that Samsung or Micron had built with global buyers. But here's the important nuance. A company does not need to be the global technology leader to become strategically important. It only needs to offer acceptable products, meaningful capacity, and a willingness to sign contracts precisely when other suppliers are constrained. In a shortage, good enough and available can matter more than best-in-class and backlogged. CXMT reportedly held about 7.7% of the global DRAM market in 2025, making it the 4th largest producer in the world. In a genuinely tight market, even a single-digit global share is enough to meaningfully influence prices and shift the balance of power in customer negotiations. Behind the headline numbers, there's a real industrial build-out underway. CXMT currently operates major 12-inch DRAM fabrication plants in Hefei and Beijing, with combined output estimated at around 300,000 wafers per month. New facilities and additional expansion projects could eventually double that figure, pushing total capacity toward approximately 600,000 wafers per month. The company is also developing operations in Shanghai, which reportedly include both DRAM production and high-bandwidth memory packaging, a sign that CXMT isn't content to remain a commodity DRAM supplier indefinitely. HBM packaging capability, even in early form, signals an ambition to eventually compete in the higher-margin segment of the memory market that currently belongs almost entirely to Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron. But scale alone doesn't win contracts of this size. What Tencent's reported commitment gives CXMT is something arguably more valuable than the revenue itself: demand visibility. Reliable, long-term visibility into future orders is what allows a manufacturer to plan equipment purchases, staffing levels, raw material sourcing, and future process development with confidence, rather than reacting quarter to quarter to a volatile spot market. CXMT received approval in May for an initial public offering on Shanghai's Star Market, China's NASDAQ-style exchange for tech and science companies. The company reportedly aims to raise 29.5 billion yuan through the listing. Investors evaluating that IPO want proof that CXMT's growth isn't built solely on policy support and optimistic government-backed forecasts. They want evidence that the company's products are good enough and important enough that large, sophisticated buyers are willing to sign genuine long-term commitments on commercial terms, not political ones. That's precisely why the reported Tencent deal matters so much to CXMT's broader narrative. It's not just revenue, it's validation, delivered at exactly the moment the company needs it most, right before it goes to public markets to raise fresh capital. There's also a bigger strategic story running underneath all of this. Major Chinese technology companies are actively trying to reduce their exposure to foreign supply restrictions. Tencent, Alibaba, ByteDance, Lenovo, Xiaomi, and other major firms all depend, to varying degrees, on semiconductors produced or controlled by companies outside mainland China. Export controls have already restricted China's access to advanced AI accelerators and the semiconductor manufacturing equipment needed to produce cutting-edge chips domestically. In that environment, every additional domestic supplier, even one that's technologically a step or two behind the global leaders' eye, represents a meaningful reduction in strategic vulnerability. Reports suggest CXMT can undercut incumbent suppliers by as much as 30%, depending on the specific contract terms, which only strengthens the commercial case alongside the strategic one. Apple, notably, has been here before. 4 years ago, the company explored using YMTC chips in China-sold iPhones, then retreated under pressure from Washington. But the situation today is meaningfully different in two important ways. First, the shortage is far more severe now than it was then. Second, Apple simply has a lot less leverage with its traditional suppliers than it did previously. When memory is scarce and prices are surging across the board, even the largest customer in the world has less room to negotiate favorable terms. That's part of why more technology companies are actively looking for alternatives. HP and Lenovo are both reportedly pursuing Chinese memory as a way to diversify their supply chains, though, as we'll get into, this is not a quick or simple swap for any company, let alone one with Apple's quality standards. A cloud company cannot expand its infrastructure if it cannot secure enough components, full stop. That gives Chinese technology firms strong practical reasons to support a domestic supplier, even one that remains behind the global leaders on pure technology. But that support isn't unconditional. It does not mean these companies will accept any product at any price. Large data center operators still care intensely about performance, failure rates, power consumption, compatibility, and total operating cost. Server memory has to run continuously under heavy workloads for years at a time. A defective module can create outages, corrupted data, or expensive, disruptive maintenance. So Tencent, in signing this deal, effectively has to believe that CXMT can meet a meaningful quality standard, not just a politically convenient one. That's exactly why this reported agreement carries more weight than a purely symbolic, government-encouraged order would. Tencent isn't buying memory for a demonstration project or a press release. It needs working chips for real servers, supporting real customers, at real scale. The contract could become one of the strongest practical tests of CXMT's manufacturing discipline to date. And success here would generate more than just revenue. It would generate operational data. Every shipment provides information about defect rates, system compatibility, thermal behavior under sustained load, and long-term reliability in the field. That feedback loop can directly help CXMT improve its future products. Higher production volumes also allow engineers to identify recurring process problems and improve yield over time. Semiconductor manufacturing becomes more competitive through repetition. The more wafers a company processes, the more opportunities it has to learn from its own mistakes and refine its process. This is one reason why large customers can meaningfully accelerate a supplier's development trajectory. Tencent may be buying memory today primarily because it needs guaranteed supply, but the partnership, intentionally or not, could help create a stronger, more capable competitor tomorrow. That is exactly where Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron should be paying close attention. To be clear, CXMT is not about to replace any of them. The established leaders remain well ahead in manufacturing technology, production scale, decades of accumulated customer trust, and advanced product categories. They also continue to dominate high-bandwidth memory, which currently delivers some of the strongest margins anywhere in the semiconductor industry. CXMT still faces serious challenges of its own. One reported problem is low yield on next-generation DDR5 products, and that matters a great deal because DDR5 is becoming increasingly essential for modern servers and personal computers. A company can announce impressive specifications on paper, but customers ultimately care about how many reliable chips can actually be produced at an acceptable cost. If yield remains weak, expansion alone will not solve the underlying problem. More factory capacity can simply mean producing more expensive, defective wafers at greater scale. CXMT therefore has to improve its underlying technology while simultaneously expanding volume SEO, a genuinely difficult balancing act for any semiconductor company. But the Tencent deal buys it something valuable: time and capital. And if CXMT can use this period of unusually high prices to meaningfully improve its yield, the competitive landscape in global memory could shift more than most people currently expect. The memory industry is famously cyclical. Shortages produce high prices and trigger heavy capital investment. High prices encourage companies across the industry to build more capacity. Eventually, supply catches up. Prices fall. Weaker producers then struggle because memory reverts to being a commodity once again, sold largely on price, with little room for differentiation. CXMT's real long-term challenge is to use this current upcycle to become genuinely efficient before the market inevitably turns. The company's recent financial performance shows just how powerful this upcycle has already been. Its first quarter revenue reportedly reached 50.8 billion yuan, an increase of roughly 700% from a year earlier. It also recorded a net profit of 25 billion yuan after reporting a loss the previous year. Those numbers are extraordinary, but they need to be interpreted carefully. A booming memory market can make almost every producer look strong, regardless of underlying competitiveness. Rising prices lift results across the entire industry, not just for the best-run companies. The real test comes when prices eventually normalize. Can CXMT still compete when buyers have more options again? Can it maintain its margins once pricing pressure returns? Can it keep investing at the same pace? And critically, can it retain the customers it's winning now once Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron have spare capacity available again and are actively competing for the same business? Tencent's long-term agreement may help insulate CXMT from some of that future uncertainty. Locked-in multi-year demand is exactly the kind of buffer a company needs heading into an eventual downturn. Now we come to the part of this story most people actually want to talk about: Apple. Reports say Apple has been lobbying the United States government for clearance to purchase memory chips from CXMT. It's worth being precise about what that request does and doesn't mean. It does not mean a contract has been signed. It does not mean CXMT memory is already inside MacBooks or iPads on store shelves today. And it does not mean Apple is planning to abandon its current suppliers. Apple still depends heavily on Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron, and that isn't changing anytime soon. But the company recently raised prices on several Mac and iPad models after memory and storage costs rose sharply, a clear signal that the current shortage is directly affecting Apple's bottom line and ultimately its customers' wallets. Qualifying any new supplier can take months, sometimes as long as 2 years, involving extensive device testing, reliability checks, factory audits, and technical information sharing between the two companies. And it's especially complicated in this case because YMTC, CXMT's counterpart in NAND, has been on the U.S. Commerce Department's entity list since 2022, meaning American companies need explicit government approval to share technical blueprints and other proprietary details with it. CXMT operates under a somewhat different, but still politically sensitive, set of restrictions and scrutiny. That regulatory complexity is exactly what makes a credible second supplier so commercially attractive, assuming the approvals can be secured. Apple does not need CXMT to replace its market-leading suppliers outright. It only needs CXMT to provide qualified products at meaningful volume. Even a limited supply agreement could meaningfully strengthen Apple's negotiating position with its existing 3 suppliers, reduce its overall dependence on just 3 dominant producers, and help Apple avoid even larger consumer-facing price increases if the current shortage continues into next year. The reported Tencent agreement may actually make CXMT easier for Apple to evaluate from a due diligence standpoint. A multi-billion-dollar multi-year server contract gives the company real commercial credibility. It shows that another major, sophisticated technology buyer is willing to make a genuine long-term commitment, not just a symbolic or politically motivated one. But Apple's internal standards are different from Tencent's in important ways. For laptops and tablets, power consumption is absolutely critical to the end-user experience. Memory directly affects battery life, device heat, system stability, and long-term product reliability in the field. Apple also demands rigorous consistency across millions of units. A supplier must deliver identical quality from one production batch to the next, support global product launches on tight timelines, absorb regional demand swings, and hit extremely strict delivery schedules. So CXMT's approval from Tencent would not automatically translate into approval from Apple. Server DRAM and low-power mobile memory serve genuinely different technical needs, with different design constraints and different failure tolerances. Apple would still need to conduct its own extensive testing, factory audits, supply chain traceability work, and negotiate its own supply guarantees, entirely independent of whatever relationship CXMT has already built with Tencent. If the technical and commercial barriers are significant, the political barrier may be even harder to clear. CXMT is included on a Pentagon list of companies alleged to have links to China's military. That listing does not create a simple universal ban on every commercial transaction involving CXMT, but it does create serious political and reputational risk for any American company considering a deal. U.S. lawmakers may argue that allowing Apple to purchase memory from CXMT would meaningfully strengthen a strategic Chinese semiconductor producer at a sensitive geopolitical moment. They may also warn that Apple could become dependent on a supplier that Washington later decides to restrict entirely, leaving Apple exposed to exactly the kind of supply disruption it would be trying to avoid in the first place. Apple, understandably, wants confidence and regulatory clarity before spending months qualifying new products and reworking its logistics and manufacturing plans around a new supplier. A deal that is entirely legal today could become impossible tomorrow if the political winds shift. That underlying uncertainty is likely a major reason why Apple reportedly approached the U.S. government proactively, seeking clearance before moving forward with any formal commercial arrangement. As of now, the White House has not publicly approved the request. Apple has not announced any supply agreement, and CXMT has not confirmed that it will supply Apple in any capacity. So the idea that Apple may be next has to remain a genuine possibility, not a settled conclusion. Still, the reported Tencent deal meaningfully changes the surrounding context. Before this agreement became public, CXMT could reasonably be described as a rising Chinese memory producer still chasing broader credibility. After a reported $3 billion commitment from one of China's largest technology companies, CXMT begins to look like something different, a genuine strategic supplier with major customers, rapid growth, expanding capacity, and real access to capital markets. That shift doesn't guarantee Apple will follow, but it makes the possibility considerably more believable than it would have seemed just a few months ago. Here's my take on why this story matters beyond the specific dollar figures involved. The most important part of this story isn't the size of the contract. It's the speed at which CXMT's overall position in the global market is changing. A severe global shortage has effectively turned raw manufacturing capacity into genuine geopolitical leverage. Surging AI demand has pushed memory chips from being viewed as a simple, interchangeable commodity component into something closer to a strategic national resource. Chinese technology companies are actively locking in domestic supply wherever they can, and Apple, the most valuable consumer technology company in the world, is reportedly considering a supplier that would have seemed politically unrealistic only a short time ago. The old memory market was built around three dominant companies and predictable, long-standing customer relationships that had been in place for decades. The new market being described in this reporting is becoming more fragmented, more explicitly political, and considerably more expensive across the board. Tencent wants supply security in an uncertain market. CXMT wants scale, technical validation, and access to capital. China, at a national level, wants greater semiconductor independence from foreign suppliers. Apple wants lower input costs and another genuine negotiating option beyond its traditional three suppliers. Washington wants to limit the growth and global influence of strategically important Chinese technology companies. Those competing goals are now colliding inside one of the most basic, unglamorous components in all of modern computing. A small memory chip, something most consumers never think about, has become part of a much larger contest over artificial intelligence leadership, industrial capacity, and national security. The reported Tencent contract may prove that CXMT is now capable of reliably serving China's largest and most demanding technology companies. The eventual Apple decision, whenever and however it's ultimately made, could determine whether CXMT is able to cross over into the supply chain of one of America's most influential and closely watched corporations. It's worth stepping back and asking whether there's historical precedent for what we're watching unfold with CXMT, because there is, and it's instructive. The semiconductor industry has seen this pattern before. South Korean firms like Samsung were once the scrappy, underestimated challengers to Japanese memory giants in the 1980s and 1990s. At the time, Japanese companies like Toshiba and NEC dominated global DRAM production, and Korean entrants were viewed largely as low-cost, lower-quality alternatives. Heavy state support, aggressive capital investment during down cycles, and a willingness to operate at thin or negative margins for years eventually allowed Samsung and its peers to close the technology gap and ultimately overtake the incumbents entirely. Taiwan's rise in contract chip manufacturing followed a broadly similar arc. TSMC wasn't always the unquestioned leader in advanced logic manufacturing. It became one through decades of consistent reinvestment, a relentless focus on process improvement, and a business model built around serving customers that the established players either couldn't or wouldn't prioritize. CXMT's current trajectory echoes elements of both stories, though it's important not to overstate the comparison. Heavy state backing, aggressive capacity expansion, and a willingness to win business on price rather than pure technical superiority are all classic ingredients of the fast follower playbook that has worked for other Asian semiconductor challengers before. What's different this time is the speed of the shift and the geopolitical environment surrounding it. Samsung's rise happened over roughly 2 decades, largely outside the kind of direct government export control confrontation that now defines the U.S. China technology relationship. CXMT is attempting something similar, but under active, explicit political scrutiny from Washington. Every major customer win gets analyzed not just commercially, but strategically. That context matters enormously for how we should read the Tencent deal. It isn't simply a data point about CXMT's manufacturing progress. It's also a data point about how comfortable major Chinese corporations have become making long-term bets on domestic suppliers, even knowing that doing so invites additional scrutiny from Washington. Let's bring this back to something more immediate and tangible. What does any of this actually mean for the people buying laptops, phones, and tablets right now? The direct effect is already visible in pricing. Apple's recent increases on select Mac and iPad models are a direct consequence of rising memory and storage costs working their way through the supply chain. And Apple is far from alone. PC makers across the industry have flagged similar cost pressures, and several have warned that further price increases may be necessary if the DRAM shortage persists through the rest of the year. This is where the strategic chess game around CXMT actually intersects with everyday consumer experience. If more affordable, qualified memory sources come online, whether from CXMT directly or from the competitive pressure its existence puts on Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron, that could help stabilize or even reduce future price increases. If political and technical barriers keep Chinese memory out of Western consumer devices entirely, the shortage will likely have to resolve the old-fashioned way, through new capacity coming online from the existing three leaders, which typically takes years, not months. There's also a longer-term structural question worth considering. If CXMT and YMTC continue gaining share domestically and eventually push further into international markets, the global memory industry could gradually shift from a tight three-company oligopoly toward a more genuinely competitive multi-supplier landscape. Historically, more suppliers competing for the same customers tends to put downward pressure on prices over time, assuming quality and reliability keep pace. That would be a meaningful, lasting change for an industry that has operated under roughly the same competitive structure for the better part of 3 decades. Of course, none of this happens quickly. Even in an optimistic scenario, qualifying new suppliers, building trust with major device makers, and scaling advanced production takes years, not quarters. But the direction of travel, more competition, more geographic diversification of supply, and a genuine new player at meaningful scale is now clearly established in a way it simply wasn't 12 months ago. If you want to track how this story develops, there are a handful of concrete signals worth keeping an eye on over the coming months. First, watch CXMT's IPO on Shanghai's Star Market. The pricing, investor demand, and disclosed financial details from that listing will offer a much clearer picture of the company's real production costs, yield rates, and customer concentration than anything currently available in outside reporting. Second, watch for any formal U.S. government response to Apple's reported request. A public approval, a public denial, or continued silence will each send a very different signal about how Washington intends to handle Chinese memory suppliers going forward, and any of those outcomes will likely affect other companies weighing similar decisions, not just Apple. Third, watch DRAM and NAND pricing trends over the next 2 to 3 quarters. If prices begin to ease as new capacity comes online globally, some of the urgency driving companies towards CXMT and YMTC may naturally decline. If prices remain elevated or continue climbing, the pressure to diversify supply, regardless of political friction, will likely intensify further. Fourth, watch how Samsung, SK Hynix, and Micron respond competitively. Do they adjust pricing? Do they accelerate their own capacity expansion plans? Do they lobby for stricter controls on Chinese memory imports? Their reaction will tell you a great deal about how seriously the established leaders are taking this emerging competitive threat. And finally, watch other major technology companies, not just Apple. If HP, Lenovo, or other PC and device makers move forward with confirmed CXMT or YMTC supply agreements, while Apple continues negotiating for approval, that could either increase pressure on Washington to grant Apple similar flexibility, or it could sharpen the political spotlight on Chinese memory suppliers even further, making approval harder rather than easier. Before we close, it's worth engaging honestly with the strongest arguments on both sides of this debate, because this isn't a simple story with an obvious right answer. The case for allowing Apple to buy from CXMT, assuming the chips meet Apple's technical bar, rests on a few solid pillars. Restricting Apple's access to a qualified lower-cost supplier during a genuine global shortage arguably just raises costs for American consumers without meaningfully slowing CXMT's growth. Tencent and other Chinese buyers will keep purchasing CXMT memory, regardless of what Apple decides. In that view, keeping Apple out doesn't weaken CXMT, it simply weakens Apple's negotiating position and raises prices at the register. There's also an argument that diversifying supply away from just 3 companies is healthy for the industry generally, reducing systemic risk if any one of Samsung, SK Hynix, or Micron faces a disruption of its own. The case against it is equally serious. Critics would argue that Apple's purchasing power is uniquely large, and a formal high-volume commercial relationship with Apple would hand CXMT a level of legitimacy and revenue that no amount of domestic Chinese business could replicate on its own. Apple's approval effectively functions as a global quality seal. Once Apple qualifies a supplier, other Western companies tend to view that supplier very differently. There's also the underlying concern about dependency. If Apple builds meaningful supply chain infrastructure around a CXMT relationship, and Washington later moves to restrict CXMT entirely, Apple could face a disruptive, costly scramble to resource that supply on short notice, precisely the kind of vulnerability the current policy debate is trying to avoid in the first place. Neither argument is unreasonable, And that's exactly why this decision doesn't appear to be a simple or fast one for the U.S. government to make. It sits at the intersection of consumer pricing, industrial competitiveness, and national security. Three priorities that don't always point in the same direction. So, what do you think? Should Apple be allowed to buy memory from CXMT, provided the chips genuinely meet its technical standards? Or would that decision strengthen a strategic Chinese semiconductor company at the expense of long-term American supply chain security? Let me know your view in the comments below, and subscribe to Eastern Engine for more grounded, detailed coverage of the chips, the factories, and the engineering decisions that are quietly reshaping the global economy. Because CXMT didn't just win a $3 billion order,